Who is Science Saru? I'm asking this because as a massive fan of the new Scott Pilgrim anime, I was even more excited when I heard that the same studio would be making the new dandadan anime. At the time, I thought they were a relatively new studio, but they've actually been around since 2013. And their two co-founders have been around for even longer and worked with some of the big names in the industry before starting their own studio. In my quick research, I quickly realized that this studio has done a ton of different projects. So while you might know them for one thing, you probably don't know about all of their projects. And there's a lot of them. So in this video, I'd like to share what I've learned about Science Saru and explain who they are, what they've worked on, and what we can expect from them. By the end of it, hopefully you'll see that they are a studio defined by diversity and a love for animation. So let's start by asking, how was Science Saru created? The story of Science Saru starts with its senior co-founder, Masaki Yuasa. Yuasa entered the industry in the 90s. He started as an in-between animator, worked as a key animator, and then later as a freelance animator. Now, I'm not going to list everything he did in his early days, but it's worth noting how this stage defined his work going forward. As a key animator, Yuasa generally illustrated in a loose way. This can be seen in Yuasa's first feature film, Mind Game. During this project, his goal was to make it look as though we hadn't worked very hard on it. So less focus on realism and details and more so on a rough-looking product that emphasized motion and expression. Which is no surprise when you learn that one of Yuasa's artistic influences is Salvador Dali, an artist infamous for his surreal paintings. Definitely keep that in mind as we talk about some of Yuasa's trippy projects. So after more than a decade in the industry, Yuasa is approached by Madhouse, one of the biggest studios in the industry. They reach out and offer him the opportunity to be a director on some of their TV series. After accepting this position, his first project in 2006 was a horror romance series by the name of Kemonozume. It was during this project that Yuasa would meet his soon-to-be co-founder, En-young Choi, who earned the attention of Yuasa through her work as a key animator and animation director. And from this point on, the two are able to do basically whatever they want to do creatively. That is, until Madhouse is acquired by a larger broadcasting company in 2010. As a result, Yuasa decides to leave Madhouse as a director, but continues working on other animation projects. In fact, he would reunite with Choi that same year to work with her at Onkama's subsidiary in Japan. This is an important stage for the two directors because it's at this time that you can see the early beginnings of the studio they would start later on. While working for Onkama, Yuasa and Choi worked in a small studio of about 25 people from both Japan and Europe, who all used a combination of hand-drawn animation and flash animation via Adobe software, a process that's now referred to as digitally assisted animation. Now, remember in the beginning when I said that the studio is defined by diversity? Well, this is what I mean. As we can see in this prologue, the two co-founders worked in an environment that was employed by animators from around the world, and used both old and new animation styles. Even back then, their work blended the best of everything. Unfortunately, this was a short-lived experience. Following the 2011 earthquake, Onkama shut down its subsidiary in Japan. Fortunately, this didn't stop Yuasa and Choi. After they left Onkama, the two would crowdfund an original film titled Kick Heart, a roughly drawn story about a masochist wrestler who falls in love with a sadist. It's a bizarre story that's only made better by its unhinged and very trippy approach to animation. It was during this project that Choi finally proposed that she and Yuasa start their own studio. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, obviously, when starting their new studio, Yuasa and Choi had to decide what kind of studio they wanted to create. Naturally, this brings us to the next question we need to ask. Who is Science Saru? In 2013, when creating their new studio, Yuasa and Choi decided to name it Science Saru for a couple of reasons. First, the English and Japanese words immediately bring to mind a combination of cultures, which has been present in their environment since their time at Onkama. The other reason is because they wanted to create a studio where there was a balance of creativity and logic, a combination of intelligence and instinct, hence Science Saru. Starting with a staff of just 5 members, the studio's first project was a subcontract for Adventure Time in 2014. The creator of the series, Pendleton Ward, gave Science Saru complete creative liberty, and the entire episode was produced in-house. As a result, this episode would come to reflect everything we've discussed about the studio and its members. In a story following Finn and Jake as they experience a cycle of reincarnation, the episode features a surreal and bizarre art style that combines a wide variety of different types of animation. The episode would become one of the series' best, and received a number of award nominations for its outstanding animation and direction. Following their work on Adventure Time, Science Saru continued subtracting to other companies and worked on a number of titles, including Space Dandy and OKKO Let's Be Heroes. 2 years later, in 2016, the studio would begin to produce its own feature films, one of which was Night is Short, a film adapting the novel of the same name that incorporated a simple and loose approach to its art style. The other was Lu Over the Wall, a fantasy story that would be Yuasa's first ever film with an original story. Both films were big hits, as each of them won international awards for their animation. Following their feature film success, they began to make bigger steps into the international market. Devilman Crybaby, released in 2018, was a pivotal moment for the studio as it increased its staff to meet its rising needs for animators and directors, and the show itself reached global popularity. So much so that Yuasa won Best Director in the second Crunchyroll Awards, and the show was awarded Anime of the Year. The anime, while characteristic of Science Saru's bizarre animation style, marks somewhat of a shift from the studio's past projects. While most of their stories prior to this one are goofy and lighthearted, Devilman Crybaby is notorious for its serious themes, dark tone, and over-the-top violence. If anything, this show serves as a testament to the fact that Science Saru is a studio that can successfully adapt a wide variety of different stories. Later in 2019, the studio produced Ride Your Wave, a romance film about a college student and a young firefighter who bond over their shared love for surfing. In 2020, Science Saru would reach even more mainstream success with the release of Keep Your Hands Off Isaacin. While not an original story, this anime is arguably more representative of Science Saru than any other project they've worked on. The story follows 3 high school girls as they form their own motion picture club and work together to create their very own anime. It's hard to believe the character Asakusa isn't a self-insert for Yuasa, as both of them have a passionate love for all things animation. Also, Asakusa is dragged into the animation club due to her lack of self-confidence. And Yuasa is also known for his tendency to doubt his own skills, despite his long history of success in the industry. But another reason this series screams Science Saru is the way it often places the characters in their projects. This series marks a turn away from Yuasa's more surreal art style of the past, as it's simpler and relatively toned down, but still reflects the studio's emphasis on motion and brings each scene to life through loose animation. Just as in the past, the series won Best Director and Best Animation in the Crunchyroll Awards for that year. Now, the reason I point out the turn from the surreal is because it's shortly after this series that Yuasa steps down as president and representative director of Science Saru. At this time, Choi steps up as president and CEO of the company while Yuasa stays on to continue working on future projects. In addition, Abel Gongora, one of the original 5 animators of Science Saru, would begin directing more of Science Saru's projects. So from 2020 onward, we see a change that can, at least in part, be contributed to Yuasa directing less of the studio's work. This can be seen in the studio's contributions to the 2021 Disney series Star Wars Visions. In the debut season, Science Saru was the only studio that contributed not 1, but 2 of the season's 9 episodes, namely T0B1 and Akakiri. These episodes would mark another step away from the studio's past surreal style as it branched out towards other styles of animation, while still retaining the usual Science Saru traits. The episodes reflect the studio's virtue of balance and diversity, as the T0B1 episode is a lighthearted story with a childlike character, whereas Akakiri is a darker story with a morally conflicted main character. Additionally, Choi and Gongora shared roles as directors. with Gongora directing T0B1 and Choi directing Akakiri. And that basically brings us to the present. So, we know how the studio started, and we have an idea of what they're capable of and how they approach each project. So now's a good time to take all of that and see how it comes together in their current projects. And what better example could there be than their most recent project? With music from the same band from the games, the same voice actors from the movie, and an art style reminiscent of the original comics. But longtime fans will notice that the art style is far from a clone of O'Malley's original work. In a recent Netflix interview, character designer Shuhei Honda admits that he heard O'Malley was a fan of 90s anime. So when animating Scott Pilgrim takes off, he and the team worked hard to blend both Western comic expressions as well as traditional anime expressions. This highlights another characteristic of the series that should be pretty obvious by now: diversity. Everything about this series is a result of blending cultures. The blending of Western comics and film and Japanese anime, the multicultural background of Science Saru and its staff, the combination of Grabinski's own composer and Anna Monoguchi to create the anime's unique music composition and soundtrack, the communications between the teams in Japan and the teams in LA. Gongora also notes how the series' humor is a blend of O'Malley's and Grabinski's humor, as well as the usual anime coding. It's hardly a hot take to say that this series wouldn't be what it is if it weren't for the diversity of Science Saru and the combination of everyone from all of these different backgrounds. But another thing that made this series so special is Science Saru's emphasis on individual creativity. As a long-held virtue of Science Saru, this is something that the studio wanted to highlight when working on Scott Pilgrim. Executive animation director Masamichi Ichiyama explains that where he had the most fun was in maintaining the quality of each animator's work, making sure not to lose their special qualities. So there's an emphasis on allowing each animator to express their own style and sense of creativity and making that the style of the final product. This is something that every fan of the anime can see, as each episode looks and feels unique. As a result, the show as a whole is something that stands out from everything else and has a sense of personality that every viewer can sense right away. But of course, a large part of the show's expression is due to Science Saru's amazing animation. O'Malley admits that he's a huge fan of Yuasa and his work on Devilman Crybaby, and describes Science Saru's approach to animation as cinematic. He further explains that, like he does with his own work, they avoid doing anything that is generic or cliched. Which is funny because you might think that a series as simple and cartoonish as Scott Pilgrim would look somewhat generic. But as we know, Science Saru avoids this with its efforts towards expression and creativity. This can be seen in how Grabinski admits that the Food Chain episode of Adventure Time changed his perception on what mainstream cartoons could be. Ultimately, the studio manages to maintain the show's personality through the same sense of expression. What's painfully clear in this anime, as with Science Saru's other projects, is their love for animation. To quote Ichiyama, "Everyone who took part is a real first-class creator, and they've all enjoyed their work." With Science Saru's love for animation, everything about Scott Pilgrim conveys some kind of powerful emotion. From the designs and expressions of the characters to the quirky icons and title screens, and of course, the action and movement depicted in each scene. This is made pretty clear early on in the big fight between Matthew Patel and Gideon. Personally, I have to point out the fight between Roxy and Ramona as well. It starts out with a cliché video game title screen and Ramona's less than thrilled face, shifts into a dynamic fight that destroys everything in its path, and quickly transforms into a trip through classic movie genres and settings. It's certainly not the most important fight in the show, but even a seemingly irrelevant fight like this one got me really invested in that respective episode. And that goes for every scene of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, right down to the little details. Thankfully, we won't have to wait for more of this kind of excitement from Science Saru, as they've already announced Dandadan as their next project in 2024. But that just leaves one question. What's next? So, there's a few reasons why everyone should be excited for Dandadan. First of all, because it's Dandadan and it's awesome. It's an exorcist, alien, monster thing series where everything and anything can happen. The fights are great, the characters are awesome. It's a manga that's regularly talked about as manga of the year, and everyone has been dying to see it animated. Another reason this is good is because this means we can expect the same kind of entertainment as Scott Pilgrim. Scott Pilgrim is full of action, but it's cute and the characters are pretty goofy. Dandadan is also full of action with insane double spreads. But on the other hand, it's an incredibly silly series that at times feels like a slice of life or a rom-com. So this is a big opportunity for Science Saru to flex all of its best talent in character expression as well as animation. Specifically because Dandadan is a pretty surreal series. In a story with monsters, aliens, ghosts, and everything in between, it's got some bizarre-looking characters with even crazier abilities. So it's not unreasonable to expect Science Saru to borrow from its earlier roots and really lean into the more surreal animation. Which would be awesome because it would be an amazing opportunity to bring back its older art style while highlighting the skills of its newer artists. Now, before I close out the video, I want to talk about what Dandadan will mean for the future of Science Saru. Some people might hype up this anime and be like, oh, they're the next MAPPA, or they might say that Science Saru is going to be the next big studio. And let me just say, no, that's not happening. Science Saru started with just 5 employees, and while they've been growing and taking big projects on ever since, they've never demonstrated any real intent of being a monolith in the industry. Their leaders have already experienced tons of success, and to be honest, that's not really what they're after. Sure, working on Scott Pilgrim did a ton to spread their name to new fans, and the same will probably be true for Dandadan as well. But don't expect them to try to be like the next MAPPA or something. Anyone who looks into this studio can tell they're not trying to make the best anime of the season every season. All they want to do is take on fun projects that allow them to grow creatively and express their love for animation. And by now, hopefully you've come to understand that this is what Science Saru is all about. They're a small studio, but they have talent from around the world and value a diverse mix of experience. They constantly take the best of both things, the old and the new, the light and the dark, and always find ways to combine whatever they can. And most of all, they love animation. And that's it. Hopefully this video helped you understand exactly why Science Saru is so special. If it did, then comment with your thoughts on the studio down below. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my video on Dandadan. In that video, I share my thoughts on why everyone should check out the manga. You can find it in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.